Hodges, and I'm the interim dean of the graduate school, also faculty in psychology, and I'm very happy to welcome you here to our second year of distinguished alumni speakers from the graduate school. So these are people who went to U of O for graduate school, gone off into the world and done wonderful things, and are kind enough to come back and tell us about the things they've done. It's the second year of the Distinguished Alumni Speaker Program, so we think that means it's a real thing. It happens annually, because it's happened for 2 years in a row. We started last year, we had a great lineup of speakers then, and this year we've already heard from biology alumna Sarah Cheeseman, and today we'll be hearing from history alum Brett Walker, who will be properly introduced in a moment. Unfortunately, we had a chemistry alum who was supposed to speak this year as well, who had to be canceled for family reasons. But we hope to get her in next year's lineup. And speaking of next year's lineup, if you have an idea about someone who would make an excellent distinguished alumni speaker for next year, we're soliciting nominations now. You can talk to me or Andy Carduno from the graduate school, or anyone from the graduate school. If you have a name, someone you think might be good. The program works in partnership with academic departments, so the guest comes as part of guest of the graduate school, part of guest of the department, and it always involves a talk given by the speaker, but then also the department can schedule other events with the speaker. Some of you have partaken in some of those things today. Deadline for the nominations is May 15th. We would especially love to get alums who have distinguished themselves outside of academia, or like our speaker today, have 1 foot in academia and 1 foot out. We really want to highlight all the things that U of O graduate students have done when they've graduated, all the varied and wonderful things they've done. And it's a group that we feel like doesn't get enough attention or credit. The series is in part to remedy that. We're very happy to partner today with the history department. And now to introduce our speaker, Julie Hessler.
All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Brett Walker on behalf of the history department. Brett's name came up as someone that we might invite to campus as part of this Distinguished Alumni Speaker Program as soon as we got the call, because I would say that he is surely one of the most distinguished graduate alumni that our history department Ph.D. program has ever produced. A few years ago, I assigned his book, Toxic Archipelago, A History of Industrial Disease in Japan, which came out in 2010 and received the American Society for Environmental History George Perkins Marsh Prize for Best Book in Environmental History. I assigned it to the history department's required graduate course on historical methods. When I was putting together, because in the summer when this sort of came together, I was acting as department head in David's absence. When I was putting together this proposal, I was amazed to see that even since 2010, he has published not one, but 2 additional books between now and then, including the book that he's discussing today, and a concise history of Japan that came out with Cambridge University Press and was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title, and it's currently being translated into Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. That's his 4th book. I want to step back for just a second and describe some of his accomplishments. Professor Walker received his PhD from University of Oregon's History Department in 1997. He spent a year in, as I'm looking at you PhD students right now, alas, he spent a year in some temporary visiting positions and then landed an assistant professorship at Yale University. That was something of a first for our department, as far as I know. But the West called. And after just 1 year, he left Yale for Montana State University. And except for visiting stints at University of Minnesota and Harvard University, he has remained there ever since. Since the year 2008, he has been a Regents Professor with the Montana University system. Dr. Walker's training was in Japanese history. He studied under Jeff Haynes from our department and wrote his doctoral dissertation and first book on the Japanese conquest of the Ainu lands, Hokkaido and islands further north. This first book, I suspect, drew on his doctoral studies here at Oregon in its explicit comparison between Japanese relations with the Ainu and U.S. relations with Native Americans. As in the United States, the Japanese conquest of Ainu territory was partly military, but it was also augmented. Military conquest was augmented by ecological change, the transmission of epidemic disease, things that again are familiar to studies of Native Americans, and above all, Japanese commercial expansion into Ainu communities. The Ainu became dependent on Japanese goods in his telling, and they gradually lost their way of life through this kind of multifaceted interaction or complex. So that book, which was nominated for the John Whitney Hall Prize by the Association of Asian Studies, established Brett Walker as a significant new voice in Japanese history. It also indicated his serious engagement with environmental history, and an emerging, at the time, subfield of history that had very few practitioners working on Japan. And as I was reading reviews of the book and of some of his subsequent books today, I was struck by, there were reviewers who assumed that you were Conrad Topman's Ph.D. student, the one other Japanese environmental historian I assigned in history to as it's called. So it was a very small community of historians of Japan who were then working in an environmental history idiom. His next book, as well as two edited collections, positioned him really as a leading voice in Japanese environmental history. The Lost Wolves of Japan, his 2005 book, traced a shift in Japanese attitudes towards wolves from reverence and gratitude for wolves, which were animals they imbued with spiritual powers, and the gratitude, it sounds so surprising. If any of you present have read John Coleman's book, Wolves, you'll be like, what, gratitude? This had to do with the fact that wolves kept deer and boars from destroying crops. So they saw wolves as possible protectors with spiritual powers. And so he traces this kind of gradual shift from that set of attitudes towards wolves to the outright hostility that led Japanese people to adopt American-style methods of driving wolves to extinction in Japan, a process that was completed in the 20th century. That book also was nominated for prizes by the AHA, the American Historical Association, the Society of Environmental Historians, and the Association for Asian Studies. And it was translated into Japanese in 2010. A striking feature of Dr. Walker's writing is his authorial voice. And here I'm kind of commenting because it was so striking to me and to the graduate students who discussed his book, Toxic Archipelago, in my class. In his Toxic Archipelago, which is his 2010 book that looks at the intersection of environmental history and the history of disease and health, it merged those two through the study of industrial pollution. He emphasized, and this also came out in his book on wolves, he emphasized the emotional experience of historical subjects who are often assumed to be voiceless, who are voiceless in most histories, whether it's wolves. Animals he assumed to experience, he treated them as experiencing pain, fear, and having other feelings. And excruciating pain is literally front and center in Toxic Archipelago, in his treatment of Minamata disease and other diseases connected to Japan's industrial pollution. And I remember in my graduate course that students were particularly interested in discussing his decisions as an author, the voice that he adopted. He had frequent first-person insertions, something that's quite rare in academic history writing, for those of you who aren't in the history field. Dr. Walker, who I've only just met today, but I can't say whether this is a general trait. He clearly wanted in these books, the Wolves book and the Toxic Archipelago at least, to provoke readers on more of a visceral level. Now, environmental history as a subfield is sometimes criticized for its tendency to write the past as a kind of tragedy, that is, the inevitable result of humankind's hubris and greed, careless neglect of the interconnectedness of ecological systems of the world. Brett Walker's overt response in Toxic Archipelago and elsewhere is that he's just calling it like this. And so, again, this I think is a very provocative stance. So I'm interested to see how this imaginative scholar of the feelings and of disease and of the environment, but also consummate provocateur, approaches genetic illness. So in just 1 second, I'm going to turn the podium over to him. But the 1 second is that I promised Lauren Pynchon, a very compelling person. I promised her to remind everyone that there's a reception afterwards outside this area, and to please sort of join in and take the conversation to a more informal level afterwards. But again, with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Brett Walker for the talk, Memory as Medicine, Reflections on History.
Thank you very much. That's an overly kind introduction. And thank you very much for that, and thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. I'm very honored that I would be considered a distinguished alumnus, so thank you for that. And it's good to see lots of friends in the history department. Always a pleasure to see Jeff, of course, and Jim. Jim's been out fishing in Montana with me before, so a lot of these relationships are ones that I've managed to maintain. So I was told that it would be good to start out with a plug for the University of Oregon, so let me do that. And just by way of talking a little bit about myself, I actually came to the University of Oregon as an Oregonian. I mean, even though I was born in Montana and raised on a farm south of Great Falls, I had been in junior high school and high school in Portland, the Portland area. And very much a creature, interestingly, of Oregon's public higher education world. I came back from an interest in Japan and enrolled in a master's program at Portland State University, where I received my MA there. When I finished up, I was completely gearing up to go on a big national application for graduate schools around the country, and my advisor at the time, a wonderful woman named Linda Walton, suggested that Jeff Haynes had just arrived here that year from the University of Illinois. Andrew Goebel had arrived a couple of years earlier, and then all of a sudden, University of Oregon found itself with this first-rate East Asian Studies group, including Bryony Goodman, and at the time Cynthia Brokaw was teaching Chinese history here at the time. So I came down to talk with people. I don't remember exactly how it transpired, but something like, hey, we happen to have a GTA available. We'd love to have a PhD student in East Asian history come. And for me, I was very naive. I actually didn't really know that that maybe I should apply to these big Ivy League schools and stuff. I said, hell yes. I mean, there's a GTA available. It's in Oregon. Why wouldn't I want to come down and go to graduate school? I mean, I was a native Oregonian and I came down and had a fantastic experience. I would just say the thing that I got the most out of my experience at the University of Oregon was being trained, frankly, as a historian and not a Japan hand. I was strongly encouraged by my advisors here at the University of Oregon to take history classes more generally. I hung out with graduate students that were in American history and European history. That's where that cross-fertilization occurred. When I was talking about my interest in the Ainu and indigenous populations in Japan, I was studying with people who were reading new books by Richard White, and Bill Cronin, and Patty Limerick, and all these people, and encouraging me to use those Western history methodologies and how I was approaching Japanese colonialism with its indigenous communities. And I think that kind of cross-fertilization was very much a result of the culture of the history department at the time. So I'm very much grateful for that. And I think it served me well in the future. It made me a much more inquisitive historian and somebody that was not afraid to dive into kind of interdisciplinary topics, which I think has been one of the hallmarks of at least my approach to studying history. So I think I did get a very unique experience here. I think I was lucky. I think it's one of the best decisions I made. If I was to look at the 5 most important things that happened to me professionally in my life, certainly coming here and being admitted to this program is one of them. And I would also say to those of you who are graduate students, when I came here, I didn't know anything about anything. And I thought if I could get out and get a job teaching in a high school or community college, I would be lucky. I had no idea that literally 5 years later, I would be hired as an assistant professor at Yale. So don't aim too low, aim high. You're going to get a good education, and my advice would be to don't undersell yourself, because you've probably got more talent than you give yourself credit for. So don't underestimate yourselves. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Unfortunately, you guys are going to be guinea pigs. This book has just come out, and it's a very different kind of book for me. It is a trade press book. It is not really being marketed as an academic book or anything, but it is very much about history. It's very much about the study of history, and it's very much about memory. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to do some sort of select readings, maybe 3 or 4 readings from the book, not too long, and talk a little bit about those readings, try to contextualize them, give you a little bit of a snapshot of what my interest was in writing this book, okay? And basically it starts out in 2010, the book does, with me having a fairly serious personal crisis. And so that's how the book starts out. So I'll just read this and then kind of move on, and hopefully you'll be able to bear with this. The book is very literary, so I thought that reading would be much better than me droning on a bunch about PowerPoints and stuff like that. Okay. I awoke, startled and feverish. Where am I thought. The back of my head pounded. I was thirsty and drenched in sweat. When I coughed, the pounding intensified and ripped along the center of my scalp toward my forehead, piercing a point between my eyes. A white hospital ground clung to my shivering body. The vision in my right eye became blurry the more I hacked. My neck and shoulders tensed as I turned my head to look out a window near the bed. I saw only the inky black of the night sky. I lifted myself upright to get a better view, and the sweaty hospital gown tightened around my shoulders, the fabric constraining me and chafing against my skin. I could feel tape tugging at the hairs on my arms and face, tying me to clear plastic hoses. I vaguely remembered that these tubes were important. They tethered me to rhythmic pumps and spherical tanks that kept me alive. I raised my body a little higher and, turning my head again, peered out the window, looking for clues to my whereabouts. I saw no answers outside. Instead, I saw only a partially transparent reflection of my gaunt face, gauzy, ashen in the dim light of some small, medical-looking machine. I adjusted my head to block the light and looked outside through my ghostly face. Below me, floodlights lit a multi-story parking structure, and a blizzard swirled in the light. The gusting winds came off a nearby frozen river. The snow, illuminated in the conical beams projected by the floodlights, made brilliant white streaks before vanishing into the cover of darkness. I was momentarily hypnotized, swept away in thought. The floodlights came to represent the present and the surrounding darkness, the poorly lit past, where the snow had come from and where it was going, into an unknown future. The night was in rapid motion, obeying wind and weather. Nothing stays in the present for long. So I continue. As my consciousness came back into the room, I heard the slow rhythm of an intravenous pump. I saw that the green light that filled the room came from an electrocardiographic machine. Then I saw a thin crack of light emanating from a bathroom, the door of which stood slightly ajar. I'm in a hospital, I thought. But what hospital? There was a woman in the bathroom. A chill shot up my spine, making me shake violently again. I was flooded with feelings of anxiety. What are you fucking doing? I shouted. You're watching me. I heard something drop to the floor. It sounded like a heavy book. its pages fanning noisily as it hit the ground. I became uncontrollably paranoid. I wanted to escape, but the damp gown, the tape, and the plastic hoses restrained me. What the hell is going on in here, I shouted. Let me the fuck out of here. The bathroom door swung open, and fumbling with her glasses, a startled woman emerged from the lit floor. Almost simultaneously, another door swung open. Fluorescent lights burst on, and a large male nurse entered, his eyes darting about, looking for the source of the commotion. The light flooded over me like a bucket of cold water, and I began to remember. I was in a drug-induced delirium, largely from the large amounts of Demerol pulsing through my veins. I was at the University of Minnesota Medical Center, dying of an unstoppable case of pneumonia and pleural effusion. The entire hallucination of snow and cold and time slipped away, dreamlike in how it came and went. As I write now, I can only retrieve fragments of it. The harsh fluorescent lights shone accusingly on my shivering body. Embarrassed, I could only muster a timid, "I'm cold." I was not doing well, and I knew it. So that was one of my first nights in the hospital, where I would have several of these hallucinations because of this pain-inducing drug Demerol that I was on, which I've since learned is not used as a painkiller anymore because of its tendency to evoke hallucinations. It turns out. Anyway, about my third week in the hospital, I was being given antibiotics and treatment to try to stop this case of pneumonia, but they weren't able to stop it. And so one of the pulmonologists came up to me and asked for an address and phone numbers for my parents because they recommended that they be called to my bedside. The day before my mother arrived in Minneapolis, doctors from the University of Minnesota's immunology department got involved in my case. One of them, a strikingly handsome research professor, had both my mother and my girlfriend completely smitten. He could have told them to put me down, and they probably would have pulled the plug. He called for more elaborate blood testing because he couldn't understand how it was that they were losing an otherwise healthy 44-year-old man. I continue. One late afternoon when I was alone, the handsome research professor came into my room and looked at the bedside charts, his back to me. Then he came to my bed and said in a soft voice, "I think I know what's wrong with you, Brett." As he started to walk out of the room, he stopped, faced me, and asked, "By the way, I need to know, do you have a family history of illness?" I just stared at him. I was eager to know the diagnosis. The immunology department had hit upon a life-saving breakthrough. Through the more elaborate blood test, doctors discovered that my immunoglobulins, particularly my gamma globulins, were virtually non-existent, and they ordered an immediate infusion of human immunoglobulins. So immunoglobulins are glycoprotein molecules produced by white blood cells that serve as antibodies to fight bacterial infections, such as the one that was attacking my lungs. I had the white blood cells, but for some unknown reason, my body had stopped producing immunoglobulins. At first, doctors suspected this absence might be symptomatic of blood cancer, perhaps lymphoma. But a battery of tests revealed that I did not have lymphoma, even though I have a significantly heightened risk for it. My doctors finally diagnosed me with the misleadingly benign-sounding condition of common variable immunodeficiency. This meant nothing to me at the time, but I quickly learned that it isn't common, and it is anything but benign. What happened next is probably in the deepest moment of my Demerol-induced haze, was a kind African-American nurse hanging a bag of immunoglobulins on my IV stand and saying, "There's magic in this bag, I've seen it before. You'll be just fine now." She wiped my forehead with a damp towel, turned her back to me, and started keying information into the IV pump. She was one of many medical personnel who dramatically entered and exited my life at that hospital, almost like angels. But within minutes, I went into rivers, a violent convulsing shaking caused by the introduction of a new medication. It is one of several possible side effects, none of which are pleasant. A chill started deep in my lower spine, beginning as a pinprick, and then spread outwards until my whole body was convulsing uncontrollably. I had never been so cold. I shook ferociously, and the nurse and my girlfriend piled on top of me to try to warm me and keep me from shaking. Someone immediately reduced the drip speed, and the chill slowly receded, and I fell asleep. I have no idea how long I slept. But after I awoke, I never allowed another drop of Demerol in my veins. I am convinced the drug made me hallucinate on several occasions. My fever began to subside. The immunoglobulins had worked. So with that, I was diagnosed with what is called CVID, or common variable immunodeficiency, which is a collapse of the body's immune system caused by an inability of your cells to create antibodies. So my immune system was otherwise working properly, but I didn't have the antibodies in my body, so it was incapable of fighting this infection. So they gave me an infusion of human antibodies, and that's when I started to recover. But I still had to spend a lot of time in the hospital. And while I was in the hospital, I was asked repeatedly by geneticists, by doctors, by hematologists, by immunologists, whether or not I have a family history of illness. And so this is how I frame the topic. When my physicians asked, do you have a family history of illness, I remember thinking, what does that even mean? I could tell them truckloads about Japanese state building in the 17th century, or the causes of global environmental calamities in the 20th, but virtually nothing about my family's history. It was a hell of a question to ask the historian in the midst of a pulsing fever and Demerol-induced fog. How are such categories as family, history, and illness even connected? I remember thinking later. The idea that words serve as historical categories was on the mind of Joan Scott in her famous 1986 article on gender, when she explained, quote, words, like ideas and things they are meant to signify, have a history. Each one of these words, family, history, illness, is historically contingent and culturally meaningful, and a skilled historian could spend pages carefully unpacking the histories and meanings they have had as they have changed over time and even across cultures. Yet my diseased body hardly felt like a cultural signifier or emblematic of historical contexts, right? There must be some real physical experience that transcends such contingencies, some physical, unimagined structure on which we can actually hang our stories. So during my hospitalization, as I inched closer to death, I became almost obsessed with the question of, do you have a family history of illness? And that actually is what birthed this project. It's kind of at the end of the project, I talk about this in the epilogue to the book. I sent the manuscript to my doctor, and I said, you remember, 7 years ago, you had asked repeatedly about whether or not I had a family history of illness. Here is my answer. And he thought it was pretty great. He's actually an amazing human being. He's a hematologist at the University of Minnesota and read the whole thing and actually kind of helped me formulate the conclusions of the book. So the book, in large part, is about a couple of things. The book is very much about the practice of history and how historians think, and how a historian might tackle a topic like family and history and illness in a way that would be professionally satisfying and feel like you're interrogating that topic properly. But the topic also became very much about memory. In terms of my ability to remember, I was constantly encouraged by the doctors to remember if I had been sick. You know, when did I start? Was I unusually sick as a child? When did I start to get infections more often than not? You know, do I remember when these symptoms? So, in a weird way, I was encouraged to constantly probe my memory in a way that I hadn't done at any point in my life before, to try to remember if I had had any recollections of when this disease might have come about, because its onset timing would be important for how we approached trying to manage it. Okay, so I'll just share with you one night another Demerol night, when I was in the bed alone trying to recall some of these illnesses. And this is kind of an important recollection for a reason that I'll talk about in a second. I'm not going to read from the book the whole time. I just want to start out with a couple of things to contextualize it. I don't want to bore anybody. So I'm at night. I remember that when I was a young boy, in the early summer of 1976, my family dismantled Quonset Hut in Great Falls, Montana, in order to move it to our wheat and barley farm near Cascade, about 30 minutes south. Cascade is a small town tucked along the Missouri River. On the west side of the river, where the town is situated, grassy hills and laccolithic buttes span southwest to the horizon until they run apart against the Bob Marshall Wilderness and Cliff Glacier National Park. The east side is predominantly low-lying grasslands and cottonwood groves that comprise the Chestnut Valley, which extends to the Big Belt Mountains. Cascade sits in a transitional landscape where the Missouri leaves behind the carved breccia and conglomerate rocky gashes in the Adel Mountains volcanic field near places like Wolf Creek and Cray, and slowly enters the vast expanse of rolling prairie near Great Falls, which extends north beyond the Highline into southern Canada. The most prominent human-made feature in Cascade is the large grain elevator, around which the entire town orbits. And for good reason. Cascade is surrounded by good farm and ranch land, particularly on the east side of the Missouri. So I was working at the Quonset with my grandfather, cleaning out old hunting paraphernalia, farm supplies, construction equipment, and other relics from his past businesses. I picked through every piece of wood and farm equipment, anticipating the mouse nests that, with their squirming little pink hairless inhabitants, lay underneath. Old tractors, combine heads, rusty sickles, dead pickup trucks, and other large equipment served as my playground in those days. I was the only grandchild that my grandfather knew very well, simply by virtue of my age. I relished working with him. I must have been a complete pest. I wanted to be a farmer so bad it ached. He was my guide. He was my future. I would beg to ride in his pickup truck when we were at the Cascade farm. Like his black lab Queen, I watched every movement around the farmhouse, waiting for some evidence that he was about to head to the fields. Dad, just take him, my mother pleaded. He always kept an old Sears and Roebuck bolt-action 22 in the truck, its barrel pointed towards the floor. He and I shot gophers with it. He complained that they destroyed crops and damaged farm equipment. To me, the reason hardly mattered. Being a little farm boy, I thought shooting at gophers with my grandfather was about as much fun as a human being could have on this planet. You know, Dad adored you, my mother once said. The fact is, I adored him too. That summer day, when we cleaned the Quonset, my mother told me before I left to help, watch Grandpa, he's not supposed to be smoking. He's very sick from smoking. At the time, my grandfather was on the early side of his 50s. In his youth and through the time in his Air Force until about 1967, he had been a powerful man. But as he entered his 50s, his health had failed. First, diabetes dogged him, and now lung cancer did. After working for a half hour packing boxes and moving farm equipment, he would have a smoke, as he always did, while sitting on the tailgate of his truck or leaning against a tractor. He rarely spoke when he smoked. He either looked to the ground, carefully pushing rocks or dirt with the tip of his boot, or he looked off into the distance. And then I continue. Leroy Belote, my grandfather, was a quiet man, and he was comfortable in his silence. I suspect he hoped other people were comfortable with it too. I imagine he felt at home with the man he was. He did not require constant movement and noise, the clumsy impulse to ripple an otherwise clear reflection on the water. That kind of clarity can expose aspects of a person's life one would rather not confront. It's like a fly fishing line on the glassy stretch of the Missouri that glides through Cascade, where we fished on warm summer evenings by the sluice gates. An angler needs a ripple to hide his or her leader, otherwise the line becomes visible and scares the fish away. Quiet does this to the monofilament of stories that binds our lives. In quiet, everything is exposed, for better or worse. My grandfather's words, because they were so few, stick with me. I know I'm not supposed to be smoking. It'll be our secret bread. He said as he took a break from dismantling the Quonset. He was clearly out of breath. I just stared at him. Within 5 months of this exchange, he was dead. And so the reason why that becomes an important part of the book is I began to really think that it was my grandfather's side of the family and my mom's side that was maybe what the culprit for this was, because I had heard rumors over the years of siblings that he had had that died very young, of blood diseases. He had developed diabetes and cancer at a very young age. And so one of the things I do in my discussion of history is with the matriarch of my Montana family is my 96-year-old grandmother, who lives in Great Falls, and got her permission to access all of my grandfather's medical records. And so part of it is a sort of discussion of medical records as a kind of archive in terms of trying to understand the body and how it's functioning in order to try to better understand how it was that I came to this illness. So there's a very sort of gritty part of the historical discussion that I call the blood archive, and trying to understand this history better through that kind of medical story. So the book is about these memories. It starts out with me trying to, at the encouragement of my doctors, probe my own memory to find out when it was that I first recalled either having people in my family that were ill, or when I recalled starting to show the symptoms from this immunological disease. And the book kind of begins with a kind of a standard history of medicine story. So when I was spending my year at Harvard, I was supposed to be there writing on an elusive history of the Pacific Ocean that I was kind of interested in writing. I have still yet to write a single word on that. But instead, I found out that Charles Janeway, who was a very well-known pediatrician and professor of medicine at Harvard University, had been the person that actually discovered my disease, and all of his papers were available at the medical school and at the Boston Children's Hospital archive. So I spent a lot of time talking about what it was about this particular man that led to the discovery of what is otherwise a very complicated disease to identify. And basically, it was from his work as a pediatrician. He's an amazing human being. He traveled the world saving children. There's just no other explanation. He's just an amazing man. And it's because of children who prematurely develop these faulty immune systems that he begins to experiment on himself by first injecting himself with immunoglobulins and other things to see if he can provoke these kind of immunological responses. But anyway, basically the story is about him being a kind of almost an extinct feature of today's scientific world, but a person who was trained in the humanities. He went to Yale University, where he majored in the classics, studied medieval history, and then later went on to medical school. And all of his philosophies of medicine, all of his papers and major lectures he gave, is all about the importance of the combination of humanistic thinking and scientific thinking for sort of ethical accuracy in this world. And so the point of the chapter is to try to make a case for the importance of humanistic thinking and how we might contextualize and discover complicated afflictions like the one I have. And then it uses Janeway's work to make a bigger case about the importance of memory in the body. So I think this is sometimes something that historians can take for granted, but it's not just, in society more broadly that memory is important, but without memory, the body would simply collapse and die. And there's no other way to really get this than to talk about the immune system. So the body is comprised essentially, if you were to reduce it to the lowest common denominator, is comprised of proteins, which essentially make things like the B cells and T cells in my body, which essentially are memory cells. Those cells remember antigens and bacteria. Because they're able to remember those things, they transmit antibodies, which serve to fight disease. These kind of B cells and T cells are so important that in an infant's developing immune system, right, they have virtually no passive immunity that they've developed yet. Mothers, through their breast milk, can pass on these kinds of memory cells, which can live for up to a year in an infant, providing a kind of supplement immune system while the child is developing. So that's why you always hear nowadays people are saying breastfeeding is so important, because it gives the passive epidemiological, if you were, immunity from the mother to the child in order to supplement. Presumably they're kind of exposed to the same disease pool, so that passive immunity works. And so memory is kind of critical for the survival of the body. Likewise, the architecture of memory that is comprised in our neuronal forests, as it were. These are built from proteins, and if it wasn't for the body's ability to selectively remember things in our lives, we would just simply be incapable of functioning properly. So our immune system relies on memory. Our minds rely on memory. So the first part of the book is kind of a look at how the body remembers and how memory is critical to the proper functioning of the body, a proper functioning body, that being which I don't have. So it sort of offers me an opportunity to talk about it in a way that maybe other people couldn't. I then get into a discussion of kind of how the mind remembers. And to do this, I've drawn on what I consider to be the more eloquent memoir writers of our world, people that have really talked about the importance of memory and how certain memories that they have in their life shape their experiences. So this is not the biology of memory, right? This is not the proteins of memory. This is not the B cells of memory, but this is people that have tried to tackle the idea of memory and how you might contextualize it in a way where it shapes your life, whether it's Richard Wright's experiences with his ill mother, which will play a very important role in his life, or Ivan Doig similarly loses his mother at a very young age, and he's constantly trying to grapple with those memories while he's growing up. So the book has a kind of then cultural engagement with how it is that we remember through memory and remembrance in the pages of some of these prominent memoirs. And basically the conclusion that I begin to reach in the book, and this was after I shared the results of Here's My Family of History to my doctor in Minneapolis, we got together and he said, you've approached your topic, Brett, as if genetics was the story. You've approached it as if to explore your family history of illness, all you have to do is look at your family history, find an example of an ancestor that died sort of prematurely, that must be evidence of this disease. And he was encouraging me to not think about genetics, but he says the key to understanding diseases like yours in this world is epigenetics. And so he led me on a kind of tour of the role that experience or historical context plays in modifying the genetics of our body. And that what doctors call the experience of somebody's life, I call historical context. The things that I did in my life that might have exposed me to a toxin or done something in my life that basically expressed a gene that may have been dormant in my family since the first one crawled out of the ocean floor or whatever. But it's been dormant. It hasn't expressed itself. But there's something intrinsic in our world today, right, that is causing certain morphed genes to express more often that might be responsible for your disease. And this is a man that does bone marrow transplant for a living. This is a guy that's trying to tackle problems like autoimmune diseases. And he would tell you, have you not wondered why there's this explosion of cases of autoimmune diseases in our society? They're some of the most taxing medical conditions on our healthcare system, for example. It's not the answer that we're just now starting to understand that is not the answer. The answer is there is kind of a new generation of diseases that might be explained through this kind of epigenetic experience of having certain kinds of exposures that are causing the expression of diseases that might not otherwise express. And in that, I drew on people who either write about epigenetics or genetics who talk about not just the fact that through what's called histone modification, certain kinds of genes that are dormant can be made to express themselves, but importantly, that those can reproduce and be passed down so that the genetic effect is permanent. It stays and it's actually heritable. Okay? So for me, the critical thing is that revolutionized the way I think about the study of history. If you're telling me that my family history is not just about the genes I inherited, which is kind of a deterministic thing, I thought my story was going to be that I was going to read about my grandfather having some sort of a blood disease, and it was going to lock me into some kind of prison of genetic determinism that I would never be able to free myself from. But now scientists are telling me the experiences I have in a lifetime, the historical context that I live in, can actually explain why this is. Said to me that, oh my God, history is even more important to understanding this topic than I ever thought it was. Because I live in a very specific historical time that might be responsible for this disease. So I'll just read for you a little bit about this conclusion with history that I reached about how this epigenetics might shape the way I look at history. So given this context, I happen to live in an age of disinfectants and plastics, for example. So I developed CVID as a result of their having permeated my porous body and blocked genetic expression within my white blood cells, while my ancestors with a similar genotype lived in a disinfectant-free and plastic-free age and did not develop CVID. This is precisely how my doctors talked about my disease. I have the white blood cells, I have mature B cells, for example, but something is blocking their secretion of antibodies in response to an antigen. In sum, I am as much a phenotype, or a collection of individual characteristics resulting from the interaction of genetics and environment, as I am a genotype. And when I think of the environment that shapes phenotypes, particularly the diseased one like myself, I understand it to be a historically constructed context, something that changes throughout time and is the product of human decisions. So importantly, history also connects our earlier discussion of the biological formation of memory, because history represents disciplined, shared memories, an institutionalized appendage to the B cells in neuronal forests. When reflecting on the importance of memory, Eric Kandel, the Nobel Prize-winning neurologist, wrote that remembering things is important not just for how people understand themselves, but also for how societies understand themselves. Quote, memory is essential not only for the continuity of individual identity, he explained, but also for the transmission of culture and for the evolution and continuity of societies over centuries. End of quote. Memory and history as a form of disciplined memory is a key ingredient to the success of societies in this regard. We transmit our shared stories through history to generations of present and future citizens, and these become the shared stories that hold national communities together. The principal difference between family history and histories of other forms of human organization, such as nations, is that most societies are cultural constructs that people forge over time through political imagination. So the continual rehearsal of our shared history in order to understand the present and plot the future direction is instrumental in maintaining cohesion. Really, there is nothing natural about a nation. By contrast, family history contains what Ivan Doig called blood grooves, ones that naturally link the present to the past in a concrete fashion within the milieu of our plasma. Social cohesion in multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multi-class societies such as the United States does not naturally spring from the soil, but rather is fashioned and learned through the political labor of people and through the researching, writing, debating, and revising of the meaning of that society's history. My family history is more natural, built as it is from shared blood and certain genotypes, but it does not spring from the soil either. It too has to be researched and written. It is not inscribed on my X chromosomes, for example. But histories of societies are just as important as family histories, because societies have only history that knit them together. Societies that fail to transmit shared memory through history are doomed to grope through life as an Alzheimer's patient does, lost in a sea of unannounced encounters, unfamiliar faces, and in frighteningly uncontextualized worlds. Consequently, a political mission of progress has driven the discipline of history from its 19th century inception, as exemplified by such historians as Leopold von Ranke. Today, many historians pursue this political mission through gritty historical revisionism, such as in the case of social historians, where past injustices are brought to light for the purposes of promoting social equity. But less popular among academics is the idea that historians must also pursue the political mission of social cohesion by doing the ideological work of the nation, by reflecting on not just past injustices, but also those unifying experiences that comprise the nation's past. It is important that historians identify the values that unite us, that is to say, as well as those that divide us. In these endeavors, the historical archive, such as the National Archives in Washington, D.C., serves as a cultural appendage of the body's memory, and historians' labors as much as proteins do, building the long-term synaptic connections of social remembrance. Simply, they connect where we are today with how we got here. The boxes, files, shelves, and drawers that comprise the National Archive are not dissimilar to the biological architecture of the neuronal forest. They too are epigenetic, as historians build them from the life experiences that made a sensory impression on us all, and which are passed down to future generations. And history modulates society much as a mother's B cells and antibodies modulate a baby's immune system. The human brain may be good at building protein-created synaptic connections for long-term storage, but the brain rots, like everything else related to me does, when we die. History, as the contentious enterprise of preserving and interrogating memories and stories, represents the social transcendence of the finitude of the organ we call the brain. History serves as the long-term repository of shared stories, ones that we debate and dispute, but ultimately pass down to others for the continuing project of building cohesion in our communities. The historical archive, then, is the cultural elaboration of the immune system and the neuronal architecture, and as such, it is critical to our development and defense as a social species. So, no doubt some of you have issues with that, but we can talk about that later. So the book then, I'll just kind of conclude with the final part. And these things do not happen sequentially in the book. These are just kind of themes that are woven through it. But the book then has a part where I'm very seriously trying to interrogate my family history to find signs of this disease, because I took seriously the idea of my grandfather's illness and trying to find this, and I wanted to come up with an answer. But to do that, the book begins a kind of elaborate discussion, interestingly enough, of historiography. Jack, you would like this. And it talks a lot about, basically how it is that historians have traditionally operated, and what has happened over the course of history and how that changes our approach to looking at the past. And it was kind of interest to me because, for example, if you look at like Leopold von Ranke or R.G. Collingwood, for example, kind of these old school historians that talked about the importance of consciousness in driving history, right? That kind of approach to history wouldn't work for me. Because even though the Walker family came over very early and were kind of involved with the Plymouth Church and were in England very early on, most of my family members' consciousness was never recorded. They were meat packers, coal miners, and farmers, right? And so they never had, a kind of consciousness that could be recorded, like, for example, Martin Luther or Frederick the Great. So I talk about this openly, saying that if the doctors are going to ask me a question like, do you have a family history of illness, the first thing I'm thinking is like, oh my God, this was a theoretical paradigm I'm going to employ, to really get to the bottom of this question, right? But social history was of interest to me, right? Because obviously my ancestors were part of a kind of class of people that can be known through a sort of more traditional Marxist or social history approach. And I kind of talk about the historiography. But my approach to the historiography is very much to talk about how, over the course of decades in the historiography, that you see what the overarching trend has been to open up historical agency to more and more players, right? That if for Leopold von Ranke or R.G. Collingwood, the importance of history was kind of pure consciousness and cognition. And for those of you not familiar with people like Collingwood, right? I mean, he goes so far as to kind of dissect your every movement over the course of a day. When you sleep at night, that's an ahistorical thing. That's not part of your history. But then you might write an entry in your diary or go to work, and all of a sudden you're a historical actor. Then you have to use the restroom, and the history switch turns off. But then you go back to work, and the history switch comes on. He makes a very serious distinction between that which is natural in our life and that which is historical, because only when we are thinking our way through a problem are we really being historical actors, right? And so I talk about the cultural turn more broadly and how that opened yet up history to more and more actors. And then I finally land on kind of my people, the environmental historians, right? Because I think they represent, frankly, the ultimate culmination of this trend towards broader participation in history. Not only is it going to be not just Frederick the Great, not only might it be the English working class, not only is it going to be women and Native Americans and others, but now it's going to be the smallpox virus that is going to be a historical agent, for example, in someone like Alfred Crosby's telling of the conquest of North America, right? So I kind of view environmental historians as representing this ultimate culmination in inviting other things in this world to be agents when telling your story of what drives historical change. So I think of words that are talking about the autonomous, independent energies that do not derive from the drives and inventions of any culture, right? Something that the cultural historians never would have liked. That kind of thing doesn't really exist, right? If you were to talk to a historian of science, but to Worcester, they very much do exist. Or, for example, Dan Smale talking about, I do not hold with the idea that a consciousness of history is a prerequisite for historicity, preferring to join with others in believing that history is something that happens to people, things and organisms, and it's not made by them. And that became something I was very interested in. Because earlier historians, if you're talking about consciousness as driving history, then history is made. History is made by the hands of people who are in charge of things, who are thinking and making history. But by the time we get to Dan Smale, we're talking about history is just something that's kind of happening. Maybe the ultimate culmination of this is with my own colleague, Tim McCain, who has just come out with a book on new materialism in history, where he writes, if this age has anything to teach us, it may well be that humans are not in control, that we do not create our world in any conscious sense, but are swept along by powerful material things that we only dully comprehend. So when I finished my section of looking at my family and looking at the historiography, I reached the conclusion that, oh my God, we have all of a sudden managed to write ourselves out of our own history. Right, and so I'll end with my final conclusions on that, and then I'll be done. So hopefully this can lead to some kind of discussion, because I think I'd love to know your impressions of this. So, kind of one of my concluding remarks. I have formulated new questions about the health of the discipline of history while writing this short book. Mainly, has the expansion of the definition of historical agency harmed the discipline and made it less appealing to young people toiling to understand our world and searching for inspiration? When E.P. Thompson, in The Making of the English Working Class, argued that the English working class was, quote, present at its own making, did he begin the process of elevating groups of people over individuals, thereby undermining the notion of individual agency in history? When Alfred Crosby in Ecological Imperialism allowed the smallpox virus and other contagions to become historical agents, demonstrating how they assisted the Western conquest of the globe, what were the consequences for our ability to think that one person alone could alter the fate of the earth, or perhaps just his or her own fate, if a lowly virus could do that too? When Timothy J. McCain, in The Matter of History, argued that the physical world, from copper molecules to fossil fuels to microorganisms to silkworms, has directed human civilization in ways beyond our direct control, did that eliminate people from their own history? Finally, if we accept the conclusions reached in this book, that we share the driver's seat of our own lives with diseases and microorganisms, is there even room in my family history of illness for me? Take this one step further. In today's theoretical paradigms, is there a place for the intriguing counterfactual narrative, such as the Star Trek episode, Sitting on the Edge of Forever? Right, in this story, the peace activist Edith Keeler, played by Joan Collins, is saved by Dr. McCoy when she is supposed to die in a traffic accident. Because she survives, she starts a successful pacifist movement, which forever alters the Earth's destiny by delaying the U.S. entry into World War II. As Spock explains to Captain Kirk, quote, while peace negotiations dragged on, Germany had time to complete its heavy water experiments and nuke the United States. As a result, Germany wins the war. In the imagination of Philip K. Dick and his men on the High Castle, the U.S. defeat led to the joint occupation of the continental United States by Japan's Pacific states and Germany's Greater Reich. I am left wondering, are such counterfactuals just the whimsical dreaming of a species that wants to believe that the fate of the world rides on a critical decision made at a crucial juncture by key people, maybe even you or me? Can one person really shape the destiny of the Earth with his or her own free will when so many other things appear to be in charge of our destiny? Our genes, for example, or the microorganisms in our gut? Can one person be historically more influential than copper molecules or silkworms? Historians Joe Gouldy and David Armitage would almost certainly answer yes, because if they have written, quote, knowledge of the past is a source for understanding the extent to which we have free will in the future. In the History Manifesto, they insist that history has much to offer young people, particularly in a time of metastasizing threats to our democratic institution and changes imposed by climate change. Most histories offer, quote, in their words, an insistence on free will and the possibility that destiny is unfixed, proof of the power of counterfactual thinking to destabilize the seeming inevitability of current institutions, values, or technologies, and the utopian histories about traditions that represent a better world than the one we have now, end of quote. But if the answer is no, they can't outcompete copper molecules and silkworms, then what message, other than sheer intellectual nihilism and political fatalism, does that send to young students of history? Does it discourage them from the study of the past and drive them into the comical light of the present, where they yearn for influence over their own lives and therefore choose other fields of study? It reminds me of the refrain from an old Stranglers tune, "Whatever happened to the heroes?" I have come to think that the notion that history simply happened rather than is being created might contribute indirectly to the widespread ambient presentism in today's world, because it takes matters out of our hands and puts them in the hands of an inalterable fate like genetics or microorganisms. Simultaneously, I have come to think that the way to remedy such ambient presentism is to personalize history a little bit more, to give back to people the dominant role in their own story. Maybe everybody should try the exercise of writing a family history of illness, just without the illness part. In a sense, if history just happens, then we are essentially just along for the ride, which I have concluded is not true. It is also not intellectually healthy and not much fun. So the book kind of concludes after this exploration of historiography that, in a world where this is what the trend looks like in terms of history enrollments in our classes, I wonder if we're not inadvertently contributing to it a little bit. That, in fact, that the direction of history for a century has been to sort of destabilize and decentralize the role of the individual in their own life, and to place that agency into everything from communities of people to viruses and what have you. But it was really only through the kind of reflection of trying to remember, trying to explore memory, and then trying to write a family history of my own experience that I really became more interested in what role in my own story do I even really have. So the book kind of concludes on a note that is sort of critical of the discipline at this point, and what are some of the steps that we might take to remedy it. So I'll just stop there because I've been talking for a long time. Thanks to the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. They thought they were funding a project on asbestos. Yeah.
So how would you specifically bring that consciousness of individuals into environmental history?
Well, I think with a renewed interest
It's a challenge for that.
It is, and I think it's that criticism has long been boiling beneath the surface. I mean, I think whether it's in the form of individual, bringing back politics, discussions of individuals. I mean, you can read entire environmental histories that don't have people in them. And I think that can be one of the downsides of the field. I mean, in my own work, I'm being very self-critical here. I mean, these are the conclusions I reach in the book. Basically, in the book I write, that I'm this creature. One of the things about having this immune disease is the vast majority of our immune cells live in our gut. So there's been all this work about the microorganisms that live in our gut. And now it's, the science is fairly conclusive on this anymore, that it probably results in different kinds of autism spectrum diseases, it affects individual behavior because these organisms are sort of competing for cognitive space in our bodies. And so we've always had this study of history, in the traditional sense is kind of the bourgeois individual working their way through the world. But what if the body is a kind of ecosystem decision makers that have their own, and this is sort of the way a lot of these contemporary scientists are looking at it. So I finally kind of draw that picture because in my body, that ecosystem is off whack and it's constantly fighting with one another. But then as I culminate with this decision about who even am I, is there even room in my own story for me, is when I finally realize this is kind of madness. Because I know that I've had something to say in my story. And I kind of refuse to accept the answer that I don't. So I think in environmental history, it could be taking human decisions more seriously, human policy more seriously, political actors more seriously, and making sure that when we write those stories, we're talking about natural change in concert with human politics and human decision making, so that we see that both the changes in the environment have been a product of maybe poor human decision making, but similarly that good human decision making might remedy those decisions as well. Otherwise, I fear that we fall into this trap of intellectual nihilism. Because, I don't know what your impressions of your generations of students are, but the sort of size of the problems, climate change, and some of those things seem so incomprehensibly big that most students have kind of given up the idea that individual people can lead to change. Yet somehow we created those problems, so you'd like to think that human decisions can somehow remedy them. So, you know, I don't have magic answers, but I'll tell you what I've done is I was talking to Marsha a little bit, and it sounds like you guys made the shrewd decision to rename some of your lower division history classes to see if you couldn't attract better enrollments in some of those. We're kind of doing some of the same things, but I designed a brand new class called Making Our World in 10 Events. So it's a humanities class that counts in the general requirements, and it's like the 10 events that I think are most important in making our world. But the first exercise the students do is they write a history of themselves and how they thought that where they were. I talk about the 10 events, and then the final project is writing a counterfactual history of where they think the world is going to go. And so I have kind of commensurate text for those. But I'm trying to do an exercise that's less about teaching topical or thematic, and more about sort of reintroducing students to the importance of time as a way of understanding where we are and what we do. And I think we've almost, it's not that kids are not necessarily interested in like Japan or something like that. I don't even know that they necessarily know that history is a valuable mode of analysis. So I think it's kind of getting back to some of the basics, and that history does have a place in contemporary. It's not just some nihilistic story of fate and destruction, and that there's nothing you can do about it because you're going to die of disease anyway, so brace yourself. That there are things that we can do, and I guess that's what, so the course is going to be a sort of a go back in time and try to reevaluate, reteach myself and students why history is such a compelling way to understand the world around us. And by do that, try to rebuild the major sort of piece after piece. Maybe not in its original form as a series of kind of nation-state narratives, but as more thematic narratives about the human condition. Yeah?
Well, very interesting lecture. Thank you so much. Lots to think about. I'm a self-employed personal historian, so work with hugely elder people to kind of put together their life story and history in a first-person narrative book with photos. And one thing that really works in our favor, I think, is that it turns out all this brain research showing now that reminiscence is very good for the brain, and that all these parts of the brain light up when you think and try to remember. So that's an auspicious thing. But I wanted to pick up especially on your cover image of what I think of as the family tree.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in the family tree as an image, and I've heard they're starting to talk about the family orchard now.
Yeah.
So just one tree, trees intermingling your branches. But with yours, actually, I'm kind of getting the impression there's a beautiful maple almost being sprayed with some pesticide or something, because here you talk about the genes were in your tree, but they might not have come out unless you had some environmental insult.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, why you chose that as the image, or if you have any sense of
the tricky thing about doing this research was anybody that would have had so there's two kinds of common variable immunodeficiency. There's congenital and acquired. And so Charles Janeway was mostly confronted with congenital aversions to children. So when he was working, and he starts out as a blood researcher during World War II, interestingly enough. And he's very much a part of developing sort of transferable plasmas and blood separation technologies and things like that, so they can be used in battlefield medicine. It's kind of the start. But it becomes once you can separate the strands of blood, you can identify separately the strands that contain antibodies. And so the first time in the 1970s, they're actually able to look at these striations of blood and see what certain things are missing. And they would give kids an inoculation and see if they developed an immune response to the inoculation, and what happened, and things like that. Right? So he's interested in congenital and kind of the difference between congenital. But in my case, it's acquired. If I had lived not in Charles Janeway's world where this blood technology had taken place, I would have died of pneumonia in the hospital. And that's kind of unremarkable. I mean, you could go back in time, and if you were a historian and you were looking at in the 18th century and you found somebody that died of pneumonia, it would be unremarkable.
Right.
So I don't know how. Because interestingly, and I didn't know this, but even in some of the most, so the Walker group is the most interesting one because they actually have documents and they go way back, and there are actually documents with them associated with the Plymouth Church and things like that. But even then, it never has cause of death or anything like that. It's just they died because they died. And they all seem to live kind of long, and there's some cases of people dying in their 40s or whatever, but if it says something like pneumonia or whatever, What are you supposed to think? Unfortunately, most of them live pretty long. I was kind of surprised as I went back. I'm like, what the hell happened to me? All these ancestors are living these long, fruitful lives, and here I am, you know, almost died when I was 44. So that proved kind of inconclusive, and so that's what led down the road. You know, so I was able to get, I mean, surprisingly, with all of these search engines now, from like library research editions of Ancestry.com and things like that, you can come up with a surprisingly accurate snapshot of your family background. You know, and again, even though like most of my Montana family, they were coal miners up here, Tracy, that were working in Great Falls and stuff, but they, you know, you can find a lot of their records, their World War I draft cards, you know, kind of things like that in their hospital records. The medical records regarding my grandfather, his sister died at 22 of leukemia. So there is blood disease that's there, that's kicking around. And I suspect that's where the action is, if I had to make a conclusion. But, you know, if you look at the CDC has these web pages where you can do your own family history illness. They only go 3 generations deep. They only want to know what your grandparents had. And they don't consider anything beyond that to be necessarily consequential. If your parents don't have it, then you don't really have all that much to worry about. So that's where my doctor, Greg Versalotti, comes in, saying, you know, I think that the CDC is warming up to the idea, but most serious physicians would tell you that's a very sort of caveman way to look at genetics. That genetics doesn't function like that. And that everybody knows nowadays that, you know, we live in an environment where there's like 375 classifiable plastic products that are found in people's bodies or something like that, traces of these things. I mean, some of the research that's come out of the CDC is just sort of unbelievable on this. So whether that's what caused mine, I don't know. My doctor's convinced sometimes it can be things like stress triggers or whatever, he doesn't know. But it could be that my family from the very beginning just carried that mutation, but it was only because of the historical context of my life that it expressed itself. I will share one kind of interesting story though, on the family side. So I'm in the middle of writing this, and my dad's taking that sort of uncommon interest in this. And I do have a couple of sort of interesting stories about my dad in the book, but that wasn't what he was interested in. He told me, he goes, hey, if you find anything about my grandfather on my dad's side, let me know. I was like, okay. And it actually turned out to be kind of a big deal. It was a bit of a conundrum because my dad had never met his grandfather. My grandfather had never met his dad. So, and this is kind of an interesting part of the story. So the Walkers are kind of migrating across the country through Pennsylvania, sort of upper Ohio River Valley, sort of classic story of American expansion sort of thing. And he's living in Pennsylvania and moves to Aurora, Missouri, sort of inexplicably. Right? And this is a family, again, that came from New England, so that's kind of a far dive south for reasons I wasn't sure. Anyway, my dad says, yeah, you know, my father always said that my grandfather was a newspaper man. He was a newspaper man, and he wrote for a local newspaper. Anyway, the local newspaper he wrote at, that was published out of Aurora, Missouri, was the Menace, which was an anti-Catholic newspaper, right? And so he was, as it turned out, a writer. And the irony, of course, is I was baptized Catholic, and I come from this roaring Catholic family, and he was anti-Catholic. He wrote for the Menace out of Missouri. Anyway, he had moved there, and when he was 58, he got my great-grandmother pregnant, who was 18. Oh, wow. She was in immediately, yeah, this is all stuff no one knew this. So then they moved to Cascade, Wyoming to separate the two of them. And that's how they had never met. So I remember meeting with my dad one time. He lives in Victoria, Casebo. We got together. I said, tell me a little bit about your grandfather. So be careful what you look into.
I wanted to go back to kind of how you ended with the historiographies. And you know, it seemed to me that the way you were setting it up was a kind of, you know, oppositional choices, that we have these, you know, quite structural big histories that give agency to viruses, and there's not much we can do about that. And you know, you see those kinds of histories as gradually having displaced earlier histories that particularly gave individual agency and then, even group agency kind of moved toward larger forms of agency. But, as you were talking, I wondered, I see this trend, in historiography. I wondered first if how much is our teaching really totally moved in that direction. And I heard a similar critique from another environmental historian. I'm sure you know Aaron Sachs a few years ago about the kinds of narratives that we're generating and how those are disempowering for students. But it does seem that in our classrooms, both things occur. And it also seems that in kind of at least popular consumption of history, both things occur. The popularity of biographies would seem to be an indication of a great appetite. Maybe we don't bring that enough into our classrooms, but I think some people do teach that way. So there's kind of a question of is the historiographical account you've given, how much does that really reflect what's going on in a variety of classrooms? But also a kind of larger analytical question comes to my mind, which is, to the extent you kind of set it up as an oppositional choice, I wonder if that's the right way to think about it, because it seems to me we ought to think about both.
Yeah,
so we could all get hit. I think there's some people who are pretty sure that, some new influenza is going to, descend upon us in 5 to 10 years, and many of us will die, right? And, there's the, fault out there, 100 miles offshore that's going to get us. And students should know that, but also then also know the individual stories and, to kind of think about, it seems students want to think about the relationship between human action and structures so that they understand structures, but they're not utterly disempowered by them too. And that we can do both, it would seem to me. So, I don't know what your thoughts on all of that are, to kind of expand your thinking maybe.
Yeah, well, let me just say,
elaborate on
how I presented it here, I did that kind of for the sake of setting up, so trying to figure out how to present this book. I did that so I could set up that final meeting, which offers that critique. That's not how I approach this in the book. In the book, I talk about how every one of these modes of thinking about history informs the way I approach different, trying to investigate different components of my family. So, for example, when I look at Neil Victor Halstead Walker, who's the guy, the 58-year-old that got my 18-year-old great-grandmother pregnant, and talk about how it is that a person makes a decision to leave a good job in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where they're like on the city council, to move down south to work for a Catholic newspaper. I talk about that kind of, you can't explain that in sort of a traditional rational choice mode, and that things like cultural history really help us with that, because you can think about things like nationalism and religion and ideology as driving people's behavior. So the book doesn't present it as an either. The book shows how every one of these approaches helps me in a different way uncover a different aspect of my family's history in a way that contributes to it. It's more my conclusions that I'm arguing against in a very unhealthy way. It's me that reaches the conclusion that I've written myself out of the story and that I find myself not doing this. So the book is a little bit misleading now that I think about the way that I've done this, because it tries to present it like I'm setting up the field for this attack, when in fact I show how all these approaches happen in America. I think you're right about the way we teach our classes a little bit, but I also think, it just depends on who the instructor is. But, for example, the case of biography, I think academic biography writing is virtually dead. There's a lot of, trade pressy historians and journalists and people of that nature that continue to write. But it's making a little bit of a comeback. But in terms of, if you were to look at books being reviewed by the American Historical Review or something like that, there's not a lot of, very serious, what I would consider, biographies. And it's slowly making, we could argue about that if the cows come home, but it seems to me that I think that that's kind of an interesting representative question, because biography is kind of the epitome of the belief that the individual can somehow affect the past, and that's why they're worth writing about. But I, from my kind of informal look at the numbers of biographies that have been published, it seems to me that it's actually been
Well, certainly that's true. I think about our own as academics production. I mean, imagine advising graduate students to do a biography for their dissertation. You know, I mean, nobody's done that for 100 years or something.
Yeah.
But I would say in our teaching, and it may not be, you know, conventionally produced biographies, but certainly many, many people are using personal narratives of various sorts. I'd say that's quite widespread.
Personal narratives of the teacher, their personal narrative?
You know, I mean, I'm just thinking of, I use slave narratives. Those would be very commonly used accounts, which I think are accounts that largely challenge narratives of human impotence against large forces. I mean, slave narratives are all about overcoming, you know, the most adverse kinds of conditions, and I think they're quite commonly used in teaching of American history. So, you know, I mean, it's that kind of thing that makes me wonder how pervasive really is the problem we diagnosed for us in terms of why our enrollments are down. I mean, I mean, there's other hypotheses that I'm sure have occurred to you on the subject, you know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's that kind
Yeah,
of...
I mean, I think there's a little bit of an apples and oranges thing, though. I mean, of course you would assign slave narratives if you're teaching a topic that was on American slavery, and of course those would be important voices in trying to analyze, you know, slavery. But I think that's a little difference between, in terms of coming up with a kind of, I mean, I would argue that that's kind of in a social history paradigm a little bit in terms of trying to retrieve those voices and how they contribute to, I mean, we all as historians do that. But in terms of, you know, talking about the importance of the individual in being able to shape historical progress as it is, I mean, I think maybe the culmination of those voices has the ability to do that, but it's very rare single voices that have the ability, you know, it comes down to a precious few people that have the ability to kind of single-handedly do that. And I would never offer this as a sole explanation, but in our case, right, and I don't know exactly what the situation is at University of Oregon, but there tends to be quite a few students taking humanities classes or taking courses like in the business school on international politics, or taking, right, there are other places on campus where students are taking courses that are kind of like mine, you know, leadership courses in the Leadership Institute and these kinds of things where they're learning. You know, I had a conversation with our previous provost over dinner one time, and we got this argument about whether leadership is a discipline, and I said leadership is not a discipline. And she says leadership is a discipline. I said, well, what is the discipline? And she said it is the study of past, you know, sort of great men and their decisions. And I said, no, that's history in the 1910s. That's the study of leadership, right? And that's kind of, so that's when it kind of occurred to me. There's actually students that are kind of they're in those classes, but I wonder if I'm assigning a bunch of books, for example, or whatever, that are, I guess, sort of, maybe it's more of a predicament of the environmental historian, but that are kind of overwhelmingly ascribing movement to things other than themselves. That I wonder, for example, you know, I've kind of taken informal polls just of my students, and they're a very fatalistic bunch sometimes, and so that's what led me to do that. So maybe, you know, maybe the critique is not fair to all of historians, as I never would think it would be, but in terms of my own self-discovery, where I logically, the book took me, out of my conclusions and how I do my methods, to a point where I virtually written myself out of the story. And that's because I am sort of the group that is a deep contextualizer. I think we are in a world that is rushing us along because of overwhelming historical forces of our times, and that there are periodically people that are able to stand up and withstand those forces. But I'm kind of Heideggerian. We are a being in the world shaped by the material and conscious things around us, and it's overwhelming and there's not much we can do about it. Yeah.
Brett, in your methods course cohort, we used to have the first set of reading assignments, maybe under a title like Then and Now, be one that included time travel novels, mystery novels, memoirs of sometimes historians about how their lives had interacted with what they were studying. Some histories that were idiosyncratic, some that were propagandistic, some of them that were sort of alternative, and books like your own would in fact fit into that. And I think it is a good idea to think of this as the starting point we're coming from. On what you've opened up about individual agency or having it done, I think this destabilization has probably been more like the past 200 years than the past 100. The immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars is, I think, maybe the real high point of what your leadership seeking provost was looking for. Back in 1818, they wrote a lot of that, and we've been through the ringer a lot of times since then. But in thinking about this, there have been over the years a lot of what we might call middle-of-the-road formulations that we can work on the complexities of all of this on. One of the most popular is Marx's and Engels, about people make their own history, but they do not make it under conditions of their own choosing.
Or the attack that consciousness doesn't drive history, history creates consciousness, right? Yeah. The idea of the attack on Hegelian notion.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways that you can take these kind of center line formulations and then understand what you see in the extremes in trying to understand the bigger reality we're in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I largely agree. I don't, my grasp of historiography starts to get very light in the Napoleonic years. But it's probably true, right? It's probably true that, the debate over what's moving history, is it human consciousness that's moving history, or in the Marx kind of phrase, is history responsible for human consciousness, right? We're kind of a product of the ghost of previous ages that create who we are, kind of thing. And that's a question that's wrestled with in the book a lot. But again, kind of limited. It's a short, trade pressing kind of book without even footnotes. So it's I was kind of limited in some respects of where I wanted to go with that and my own thinking. So, but point well taken. Yeah.
I think this should be then the last one before we move to
then I don't mind to be the last question, so.
Yeah,
But I'm interested, I guess, if I were to ask a question, maybe it won't be the last one out, and the other one I'll just comment to you privately, but is the relationship between writing Toxic Archipelago and writing this, like how did the fact that you had written about these diseases among the Japanese affect the way you think about your own history of disease, and like how would you have come to write this book had you not written that book?
Well, I talk about it just very briefly. I don't talk about much about my own writing, but I do talk I just have a sentence or two about that book, because when I was writing that book is when my symptoms first started. I was in the hospital all the time. I was having infections. I was on antibiotics. That was a very tough moment in my life. And it kind of occurred to me afterwards when I started thinking about it that I actually might have been rehearsing my own bodily symptomology through the subjects of my history. I mean, the whole book is about pain. And so it is deeply depressing. I was giving a talk at Yale recently, and Valerie Hansen said something. I was about ready to start, and she goes, "Do you ever write about anything? Everything you write about is so damn depressing." And I was like, you're right. It sucks. I'm done with. I want rainbows and ponies from here on out. But I honestly think in that phase that was a little bit of what was going on. Not this book. only just sort of looking back, it was kind of the only thing I recently divorced, I was living alone, and I was sick all the time, and nobody had an answer to what was happening until little, my health. You go to the Bozeman Hospital, there are like a handful of antibiotics, because the disease is extremely rare. So no one would want to do these elaborate, expensive blood tests to see, if this is what's going on in your body. So it was only by the luck of having the handsome research professor at the University of Minnesota, right, that I actually did it. But I look back and I'm like, what was the mindset I was in, where I'm, reading about pain, discussing pain, talking about pain, narrating pain, sort of documenting pain. And I think, maybe it was because that was all that I was kind of surrounded by at that point. So it's just kind of an interesting example of what our mental state can do to the way we look at the past, for sure. Yeah.
I'll just say real quickly that I've dealt with this issue in my own teaching about, because my class I teach environmental history in two quarters now. One in my own mind is death and dying, and the other is the rise of the conservation and environmental movements. But students do get a very much of a, and I experienced this when I was at the last place that I taught at, they're sort of like, well, it's all screwed up, so we might as well just keep on screwing it up, why change? And so I'm consciously, but Bill Carnan taught me this, my last lecture each time is like, because it's been peppered with people who've done things through the course of history, and so I try to remind them, remember, individuals made a difference. Here are all these people that made all of these differences, or movements, social movements, made a difference. You can be part of that, you can have agency in that.
See, I resisted him when he edited that book.
What?
When he was editing the final copies of Toxic Archipelago, right, he said, can't we end this on a slightly more positive note? And I was like, no. We're going to be negative all the way down.
You have to end it on something positive, or nihilism is the result.
But I'm disappointed about like slave narratives and stuff. I can't get this out of my head. When I teach, for example, about indigenous communities in Japan or like Korean minorities in Japan, I have lots of narratives of those people, them writing and things like that. But to be frank, it doesn't mean that they were driving history. It doesn't mean they were there, they were experiencing it, they were being economically abused, they were being colonized, they were all these things. But just because they have a voice that's recorded doesn't necessarily mean that they're people that are moving the past. They are experiencing the past.
It's certainly true, and in my own work, there is a difference between voice of, whatever, I don't know, subaltern peoples or whatever, and agency. I take that point, but the slave narratives and teaching, I was teaching in the U.S. History Service, so this is, in a way, kind of our standard thing that we offer to the general public of students to say, most of them are U.S. students, so they, in terms of creating a national narrative, which we're talking about in another context. So, if you give them, Frederick Douglass, or if you give them Harriet Jacobs and have them read it, some of them will be inspired. Because here's a freedom fighter. And also, the movement that they became a part of succeeded in very substantial ways, of course, than their setbacks. But, a lot of students will be inspired by that. Other students will be, chastened in some way or another.
No, I like that story, and I think one of the examples might be one
works, I think,
it might be, this might be one of the negative impacts of kind of the Anthropocene climate change studies on environmental history. It's one thing if your stories are about creating national parks, saving wilderness lands, cleaning up a local stream, because those are those kind of stories where you can talk about people that are politically active and doing things. But if you're talking about an irreversible planetary scale force that threatens existentially human species, it's sort of hard to talk about that.
It is hard to find.
And I think that the Anthropocene has kind of poisoned our conversations. And I think it has. You could almost say that it's so overwhelmingly big that it's had a very negative impact on how environmental history sees itself.
But Greg, in your own field, there's a famous monograph, I believe, I don't remember the author, that is all about how the Tokugawa幕府made Japan much greener, especially with
That's
trees.
commentary.
That it had been. You know, that's the narrative of environmental success.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, as remade by Jared Diamond.
Maybe that's a Peggy Lee moment where we say, is that all there is? And, go have a ball.
Well, thank you very much for coming.